3, 2, 1.
There we go. All right. So everybody, welcome to a leather dye class. So what we're going to do today is we're going to chat a little bit about kind of what we know about period leather dyes. And then I'll walk you through some of the experiments that I have done over the years. Now, I have only touched the surface of these dyes. I think there's about 80 to 90 recipes that I have so far, and I've only done maybe 10 of them. So there's still lots more work to do on figuring all of this stuff out. Um, Really what my goal is with this class is twofold. It's, hey, period leather dyes are cool. But also it's about knowing what colors were producible in period. You may decide down the road that I'm making a belt for someone and I don't know if I want them walking in the rain at Penzic and suddenly their garb is blue when it was white originally, or those sorts of things. So you may choose. There may be reasons why you choose to use period leather or not use period leather dyes. But that doesn't mean that you can't use your knowledge of period leather dyes to pick colors of modern leather or modern leather dye that are more representative of what they would have been able to produce in period. So, they wouldn't have had bright red leather that's, let's say, this color, right? They wouldn't have had kind of the same tones that we have, but they did have red leather. They did have blue leather. They did have green leather. So it's just that's kind of my big thing is knowledge, right? It's knowing what you can produce using the period leather dyes and then making a judgment call about whether you want to use it or not. So that's exactly how I got in, was working on this project, which the blur is not helping. It's a stick purse. And the descriptions of the period artifact I was reproducing said the handle had colored leather, and I was doing it for Kingdom A&S, and I'm like, I don't know how to produce period leather, or period leather dyes. How did they do that? And I couldn't find any information on it. So 2 years later, I did a second Kingdom A&S project. So um, there's basically two ways that they would have added color to leather. One would be painting leather the same way we do it modernly. So, you would tool the leather and then you would paint highlights on it and that sort of thing. I'm not really going to talk about that. The second is dyeing the skins. And so that's what we're going to get into today. Um, there's so far I've found 5 recipe books that are listed in your handout. Um, it goes back. I was surprised. The earliest one is from like the 9th century. Most of them are late period, so they're kind of 1600s. There's a lot of post-period ones that I don't list in the handout because they're out of period, but I mean there may be some good information in there too. Um, it's not clear who was doing the leather dye, and that may have varied from place to place. If you look at the way that the dyes are represented, though, they're for large volume. So you're talking about, multiple skins worth of dye. And so it's probably the case where it was someone who was doing a large production. Um, it's also grouped in with other dyes, right? Like we were talking in the chat room, the Plictho is the main big dyer's manual for pretty much everything, and it's got all of the dyeing in it. It's got all kinds of other stuff in it for wood and bone and leather and fabric. And so the question is, was it the Dyers Guild that was doing the leather dyeing? Was it the Tanning Guild? Was it the couriers? Like who was doing it? We don't know. I did try to do some research with the London guilds, and there's no record of that I could find of who was doing it. Um, but it's probably the case that at least in the big cities, it was one of the guilds that was doing it. And it would have been like modern, where the leather worker goes and buys some dyed leather and they use it to make their thing. Um, which is kind of makes sense because that's the way most of the industries worked in the big cities, at least, was, every their little lane, and you pass it from one to the next, and then someone makes the finished product. So it's not that much different than what we do, where you go into the Tandy or the Zelikovic leather or Tundra leather or whatever your local leather store is, and you buy some pre-dyed leather, and then you make it as a leather worker. So all of that is to say, what you do currently is pretty similar to probably what they were doing in period. They were just using different dyed leather. Um, the other thing I'll mention too is there's different kinds of leather that might have been dyed. And so like we're familiar with vegetable tanned leather. That's kind of the one that we primarily use. But there are other period leathers that could have been dyed. Um, and so when you're reading through the instructions, sometimes it'll kind of merge the tanning process in with the dyes. And other times it's telling you to add tannins for a particular recipe. That suggests to me that if they're using a leather like an alum Todd leather or something that doesn't have the natural tannins that a vegetable tanned leather would have. And so that can explain if you're experimenting with some of these recipes and it's not working quite right. It could be that it's for a different kind of leather. So you have to kind of interpret the recipe. You may have to modify to work with the leather that you're using if it's not a vegetable tanned leather. So, some of the black leathers, they suggest that you need to add tannins. But you may not have to, because if you're using vegetable tanned, it's got the tannins already in it. So there's all kinds of kind of experimentation that you can do. And I've done that with the blue recipe when we get to it, because I haven't been able to get the blue to work ever, ever, ever. And I've tried it on, I bought some alum Todd and it worked a little bit better on the alum Todd. I bought some chamois leather to try that, and it worked a little bit better on that with the rougher surface. So try to do some experimenting. Um, as far as beyond the recipes, we do have, there is a fair bit of evidence, of physical evidence of dyed leather items. The artwork, it's hard to interpret artwork because you don't know whether or not um, the material that was used for a pouch was fabric or leather, right? So like you can look at a painting and you may know, it's hard to say. But the stick purse that I showed earlier, that one is from the Frieze Museum, listed in Purses with Pieces, or Purses in Pieces, which is kind of the preeminent book about pouches. And Gubitz specifically mentions that the handle was colored. Um, if you look in the handout, I've got an example of a book cover that is from the 7th century, the St. Cuthbert Gospel, and it's dyed red goat skin. So there's lots of artifacts that show, and that's early, like that's I would not have expected 7th century red goat skin book covers, but there you go. So there's lots of evidence that leather was dyed in period beyond just the documentary sources of the fact that there were recipes. Um, so one of my pet peeves is when people say, "Oh, they didn't have colored leather; it was just browns and blacks," because that's what comes out of like the artifacts when we find them, right? They're all stained, and so that is not true. We've got lots of evidence that there was dyed leather, and that it's more than just browns and blacks and so. I like to disprove that particular myth right away. All right, so I think I saw a question. I don't know, Orla, were there anything coming up in the chat before I go on?
There is Isabella de Firenze was saying she desperately wants to figure out dyeing leather with indigo, which is her jam. She's going to be teaching 2 of the classes today. She says, although the first step is getting the leather ready to dye. So are there any preparation considerations she would want for that?
So the indigo is the one that I haven't been able to get to work. I have talked to other people who have been able to get it to work, so I'm still pulling knowledge on how to do it. Um, the recipes are really varied. So indigo is probably one of the most common recipes in the books. And I've tried 3 or 4 of them, and I can get the blue. Like I've got some pictures in the handout, and I've got it here. So I can get the blue on the leather, but it wipes off. It doesn't fix to the leather. Like if I do that, it's on my finger. So I still have to figure out kind of getting it to bind. But other people seem to have been able to get it. So it's possible. I just don't know the answer to that. So if you ever figure it out, you let me know, because
I
it's one of the
absolutely
ones that
will.
I haven't been able to get to work.
Yeah,
'Cause that's interesting.
I have also like dunked a strip of veg tan into a vat and gone, yeah, okay, that oxidized and turned blue. I wonder if some of the rubbing off is because indigo sits on a surface.
Yeah.
And so excess pigment will come off, but eventually that'll stop, like blue jeans when they wear through.
Yeah, it could
Suffer
be.
the same surface problem.
Yeah, maybe I'm not doing enough
Well,
repeating
it
to get
just
it to
doesn't
soak in.
want to be a penetrative dye. It
Yeah,
sits on
It
top of whatever
yeah,
fiber it's
um
on.
yeah,
yeah, my I mean for reference, my Science of Indigo class describes exactly why indigo has to go through a stupid long process to dye anything.
yeah,
Um it would just be adapting it for leather, which isn't as penetrative as like
exactly.
fiber. So
Yeah, so it's definitely doable. I just haven't been able to experiment with it. And some of the limitations that I have is I have a rule where I don't use bodily fluids in my dye recipes. So and that limits some of the recipes that I can
Mhm.
experiment with. And other
you,
ones
you don't
use
want to do
substances that
urine
I
indigo
don't want
dyeing?
to
No.
touch. So
I will
Replace
not
with
touch urine
fruit
indigo
juice.
dye.
so yeah, so it's totally like I don't have the numbers in front of me, but one of my projects lately since post-pandemic has been to build a little database with like all of the different recipes and what the main pigments are, and indigo is the most common ingredient. There's dozens of them of different
Yeah,
recipes with
I've read
different
through it.
techniques, and yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
And then I see that there's a question from Gonzalo about brain tan. So yes, they absolutely, brain tan is a period leather. It's I haven't experimented with it as far as the leather dyes. Um, but again, it's a different process. So they don't spell out in the manuals what process they use to produce their leather. There are some tanning recipes in the sources. And so you kind of have to try it and see what works, or use some logic, right? So look at the recipe. Is it You have to have a little, like I am not a chemist by any stretch of the imagination. I barely pass science. So you have to kind of interpret it and say, well, if it's trying to produce black and there's no tannins in the leather, I'm gonna have to add tannins, right? Like it has to. There's no other way for that chemical reaction to happen. But for a blue, maybe it'll work better than on a veg tan. All right. So that's kind of the quick history of the leather dyes. So like I said, there's 5 books. The Plictho, which I'm assuming most people will know about the Plictho. The Plictho is from the 1548, I think it is, and it's like a massive book. And you know, it has every dye thing you could possibly imagine. So that's kind of the primary source. But there's 4 other ones. The other ones I got all through Elizabethan Costuming. They have it all online available, so the links are in your handout. But they've actually got the full recipes online. The Plictho is not officially available online, although some people may have scanned it and posted the document. I actually got permission to reproduce the recipes from the owner of the copyright. So you are legally allowed to have it. Um, so those are the 5. The colors, there's blue, green, red, black, yellow, brown, gray, there's gold, there's purple. And then there's some odd ones like peacock. Like, I don't know what that means. Like or green purple. Like, what does that do? And then there's something called a pandius, which as far as I can figure is it's like a multi-stage dye, and depending on your ingredients, it gives you a different color, but it's all in the family of Pandius. Um, and to your question in the chat that I just saw, it's not a 15th century copyright. The latest copy of the book was produced, I think, in the 1960s. So the book that we all have, or the copies of the book that we all have, is actually still under copyright. I can't remember. I think it's like Oxford Free Press or something like that. It's one of the big presses educational presses in the States. But the book is out of print. So I reached out to them and got their permission to reproduce it and share it on the internet, because that was one of my pet peeves, was nobody was sharing their knowledge on the internet. It was like there were people selling leather produced using dyes, but they wouldn't tell you how they produced the dyes. So I was like, nope, that's not how this is going to work. So yeah, lots of different colors. And the other thing to keep in mind is, like, for the blue, for example, there might be 24 blue recipes, but that's a family of blue, and they could be multiple blues within that range of colors, depending on the ingredients and the recipe. You can also get different colors of blue depending on the leather that you use, or any of the colors. And that's the other thing with natural dyes, is they're very sensitive to change. And if you've done fabric dyeing, you know that you can kind of change the color by adding or taking away. Or so, couple of tips. This is a good time to talk about. I always use purified water at the pharmacy. If you use tap water or even just kind of generic bottled water, there's going to be mineral content in there that's going to change your result. And like Lucia, who is not in the class because she's moderating the main chat room, actually did an experiment with fabric dyeing where she got everybody to provide tap water from their house to see what the color came out with. Because I can tell you, like, my tap water here is very high in iron content, which is really going to skew what your result is. So you want to control as many variables as you can from batch to batch. So that is the water that you use. That is the pot that you boil it in. I once made a yellow batch using a metal pot, and it turned green instead of yellow because the aluminum in the pot changed the color. That's like the acidity of the mix, right? So I can take a Brazil wood red dye and turn it purpley brown by adding a Tums tablet to it, because it changes the acidity or the baseness of the mix. So all of that kind of the leather that you're using, everything, every piece of the process can affect the color that you get and the result that you get. That can be good, like adding a Tums and you suddenly get a completely different color, or it can be bad because you are working on a deadline for a specific project. I don't know what you're talking about. And suddenly your yellow dye is green and you were supposed to have yellow. And then you have to decide if you're going to remake a batch or you're going to say, you know what? in period, they would not have started over. They would have just gone with whatever color they got. So that's what we're going to do. So just keep that in mind. The sources really matter. The other thing that you'll find, some of the recipes are for berries and stuff like that, and the ripeness of the berry can affect things. So the most common ingredient for green is called buckthorn berry. It's an invasive species here. So nobody's going to complain about you going through and harvesting buckthorn because they don't want it. So buckthorn berries, in their unripened state, produce one color. In their ripened state, they produce another color. And depending on when in that ripe to unripe phase you harvest them, you may get more of a yellowish color, you may get more of a greenish color. So again, these are all natural things, and there's no way to control for them, right? Like, unless you are an expert on when berries are ripe, you're gonna get whatever you get with your berries. So you kind of have to just go with it. So maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions before I get to the actual recipes. I don't think there's any questions. I think it's just comments in the chat. So let's keep going then. All right. So if you're following along in your handout, we're going to start with the yellow. So the yellow that I did is from the Plictho, and it's super, super easy. Everybody can get turmeric at the grocery store. It's cheap. It's really easy to make. My Laurel mocked me a little bit because the easiest one to do is black, and I saved it for the end, but I wanted to get colors. So I started with this one, and I lucked out because it worked the first time, no problems, which was why I was so angry with myself when the second time I made it, it turned green. Because I was like, but I made it the first time, it was perfect. So basically all your ingredients are, it's turmeric, it's alum, and it's the purified water, and you boil it all together in a pot. Like, it's that simple. So the most complicated thing about this recipe, and you'll find this if you've done cooking, period cooking, redaction, any really recipe redaction, is figuring out your measurements. And so particularly in the case of Italy, it can be finicky because every city-state in Italy had a different measurement for the same quantity or for the same term, right? So a mezzette in Rome might have been different than a mezzette in Venice. So good luck. I don't know. Again, there's a lot of experimentation involved. So in this case, I used a 19th century reference to get at me something close to what a mezzette should be. And as I mentioned earlier too, the recipes again were large batch recipes for probably multiple skins. So you're gonna want to downsize when you're doing this, unless you're planning on mass producing, multiple cows worth or goats worth of leather. So the recipe that I've given you, I've downsized it to a much more manageable amount where I could do it in, a single pot on a single burner stove. I tend to not do my dye recipes on my kitchen stove. I have a little plug-in burner because a lot of them smell and I don't really want it in my kitchen. I can do it outside or in the basement or something like that, and I don't want to dye going everywhere on my nice kitchen stove. So yeah, you just you combine it all, you boil it. I did it for about 20 to 25 minutes. You want it to kind of get about a third, I think, down. And then you apply it to the leather and it's yellow. It's like turmeric. If you've ever cooked with turmeric, it's a really like it's a yellow, right? It's kind of a mustardy yellow. So this is what I got in there. So it's a kind of it's definitely yellow. It's faded to more brown. This sample was done probably 6-7 years ago now, so it's still yellowish. I would say the recipe tells you to apply it hot to the leather, which I thought was really strange. Because if you've done leather working, you know that that's how you harden leather is by putting it in boiling water. So I didn't really want to harden my leather, but it didn't, because by the time you turn it off, it's no longer boiling. And then you dip your brush in and you paint it on, and it's cooled enough that it's not going to harden your leather. I did experiment with cold and hot, and it didn't really make a huge difference as far as I could tell. So it's kind of up to you whether you want to apply it straight out of the pot hot or whether you want it to let it cool. It fixed really well. It doesn't easily rub off. I haven't put it in the rain to see what would happen to someone's garb if they had a yellow belt and without putting a finish on it. But it's probably one of the better fixed of the period leathers that I've done. And yeah, it's a nice mustardy kind of yellow, so it turned out pretty well. There are a few other yellows, but that I haven't tried any of the other ones because this one worked out so well. So I can't tell you if some of the other ones produce a brighter yellow, but this looks to me like a nice period yellow. So it's a good example anyway. And it's definitely not the sunshine yellow dye that you can buy at the leather store. You probably would have to, well, I'm not going to say that. They might sell one that's similar to that. But you might have to mix your own dye to get something close to that. So moving to the green, I love this one because it produces the ever famous goose poop green color, which is a favorite of the Tudor era. So this one is buckthorn berries, like I said. That's the most common dye stuff that's used for green in the leather manuals. Um, Sometimes they use other names for it, but if you do your research, it's the same thing. It's just they've called it something different. Um, and so again, you have to be careful. This is the color that I got with my first experiment. And again, you might be able to see it. I'm not sure. But it's a yellowish green, hence why it's called goose poop green. Um, but it varies batch to batch, probably more than any of them because of the berries. I've tried it using actual fresh berries that I've harvested locally. I've tried it with dried berries that I've online from the States. And I've tried it with an extract that I ordered online from here in Canada. And it produces the same range of colors. It's always in that kind of greenish yellow. But sometimes it's more yellow dominant, sometimes it's more green dominant, depending on whether the berries are ripe or not. And sometimes you can buy specifically the ripened or unripened extract so that you can get the green or the yellow, depending on what you want. So again, this one, it's a fairly simple recipe. You've got your buckthorn berries, you've got strong vinegar, which again is one of those terms that they don't define in the manuals about what strong vinegar is. So I used cleaning vinegar. It's basically the strongest vinegar you can find, use that. So if you can find in the grocery store, if you can find the cleaning vinegar, that's generally the strongest. But if you can't find that, just find this, something that's got a high acid level, and it'll work. It just will take maybe longer to extract what you need. And then you've got your owl there. So with the dried berries, I soaked them to try to get the juices out of it. With the fresh berries, I did what I call muddling them, which is a drink term, but like I squished them in the bottom of in the pot to kind of extract the juices. But otherwise, the process is more or less the same because really what you're trying to do is get the dye out of the berries, right? So the dried ones, I figured there's no juice in them because they're dried, so I've got to get them some liquid in there to try to get it out. And yeah, so it's otherwise again, you're boiling it together and then you're applying it to your leather. This is another one that had a really interesting measurement. It told me to boil it for the length of, I think it was 10 paternosters. Not helpful. What language? What speed is the person saying their paternoster? Like, I don't know. I don't go to church, so I don't know how long it takes to say a paternoster. But I work in communications. I've done speech writing. I know what our standard is for how many words it take or how much long it takes to say 10 words. So I used that formula and looked at a paternoster, figured, okay, they probably said it in Latin. So how many words? Okay. And I figured out how many minutes it takes to say a paternoster times 10. It's just ridiculous, the math that you have to do. So my guess was that it's about 1 to 2 minutes for a paternoster. So if they're saying 10 paternosters, I boiled for 10, 15 minutes to give it a try. But again, you're experimenting. There's no way to know for sure what it is. So like try it and see. It seemed to work fine in that 10 to 15 minute range. But yeah, that is the green recipe. It's certainly an interesting green. If you're making something for someone who's a tutor period, they will love goose poop green. It is like the in tutor color along with some oranges and stuff like that. It's amazing. Um, the other interesting thing, if you look in the handout, I've got a page from a dye book where they've tried applying it to different types of leather. So you can kind of see the slightly different tones that you get if you apply it to goat versus pig versus parchment. So again, you're going to get different results depending on the leather that you're using, which is really kind of the fun part of experimenting with this, I think. So we've got the black. This isn't a dye. It's not a dye. And unlike black on fabric, black on leather is so easy. The fabric dyers around me like look at me and I demonstrate the leather and I just like brush it on and it turns black and they get very angry with me. But because leather has, or at least vegetable tanned leather has the tannins already in it as part of the tanning process, um, all you're doing is basically finding a way to get the iron into a solution and then you brush it on and it causes a chemical reaction with the tannins that are already there and it turns the leather black. It's not dyeing it. It's not applying a coating of black dye. It's you're chemically turning the leather black. Um, and so there's lots of ways of doing it. The kind of not so period way is people will take the iron wool that you use for scrubbing in kitchens. They throw that in the vinegar and you just let it sit. I tend to use rusted metal and just kind of like everybody's workshop has a bunch of rusted nails and stuff like that. And you just throw it in and it basically the vinegar strips the I think it's iron oxide if my chemistry is right, it strips it off the metal. Your nail becomes nice and clean. So you can take your nail out and actually use it again. And you've got like this reddish kind of substance. And then when you brush it on the leather, it blooms, like it turns black. Yeah, so it's called vinegaroon in some of the kind of later dye manuals. It was used Civil War era for boots and stuff like that. Like it's been used throughout time basically. And it's super, super easy. Some of the recipes, and I did try this, they tell you to add some gallnut extract to the leather. I think this is for leathers that are not veg tan. I think what it is those dye recipes are for alum tod or brain tan or some other type of leather that don't necessarily have the tannins already in it. And so you need to add the tannins, and so then it's more like a fabric dye where you're kind of adding some liquid and then adding the other liquid on top of it to get the black to occur. I did that on some veg tan. It didn't produce a better black. It was messier because you've got two liquids reacting to each other as opposed to reacting to what's naturally in the leather. So it got all over my hands. Um, And don't forget your hands are leather. So like if you're dyeing things, your hands can get dyed too. Um, so to me, it's an unnecessary step. There has been a lot of discussion online about whether you need to stabilize your black leather with like a baking soda solution after you've done something with vinegar. Um, and I mean, I've done stuff without stabilizing it afterwards, and I mean, I have not noticed any degradation of the leather at all. Um, it might help take away some of the vinegar smell from your black leather, but I'm not sure it's absolutely necessary to do it. I've also seen some discussion online about whether by causing that reaction to happen, you're actually leaching some of the tannins from the leather itself. So that could, I don't know the chemistry well enough to know whether that's a thing or not. But I mean, I'll go back to this. Like this stick purse is 8 years old. This drawstring is as solid as it ever was. Oh, I just snapped it, but that's because it was a thin leather. But like it's not noticeably degrading the leather. Um, barring, pulling on it really hard with a really thin, light leather. Um, so yeah, so that's the black, and it won't rub off. So that's the one that I don't worry about it, like in a rainstorm. Like if you want to do a belt using that or boots doing that, like it's because it's a chemical reaction. It's not going to rub off if you apply it to leather. Sandra, did you have a question, or are you just wanting to be on screen? I wasn't sure.
Me? No.
Okay, perfect.
Nope.
No, I just thought I'd check. All
Just
right,
for a
so
heads up, 15 minutes left.
yep. All right, so is the blue. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the blue because we talked about it earlier. I haven't been able to get it to work. Good luck. Please tell me if you do get it to work. I'm still working on it. Through this class, I was put in touch with a Laurel from Ethelmark who did was basically his Laurel level project was leather dyes, and he was able to get the blue to work. So he sent me his documentation. So I'm going to read through it and figure out what he did differently. So hopefully next time I give this class, I will have an answer to the blue question. But yeah, tricky. What more can I say? So moving on to the red. So this is another recipe from the Plictho. There's a bunch of these. A lot of them use Brazil wood, which, despite it being called Brazil wood, is a period tree. It is not from Brazil necessarily. I can't tell you why it's called Brazil wood. Um, and it's a red leather dye. So let me see. Sorry, I don't have it on me. Here we go. So I bought my Brazil wood from Maiwa in BC. So if there's anyone from the West Coast, Maiwa is an awesome source. You can't smell it, but it smells really nice. And it's basically a red wood. So I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it's basically a red sawdust. Um, so basically what I do is I throw it in the recipe or in the vat with water and some gum arabic, and I steep it. So I extract as much of the dye from the wood as I can. So like I'll steep it for as long as I possibly can, like 24 hours, whatever, right? Like you're blooming, you're trying to get it, extract it before you then boil it and cook it and do all of your stuff. Um, the tricky part with this, and again, once you've boiled it, you're applying it to the leather. Um, don't let it dry fully between your coats. That was my experimentation. That I painted it on, I let it dry fully, and I got brown leather. I painted another layer on, let it dry fully, Still brown leather. Like it was not, it was just fading completely, but if you let it dry completely. So what I did was paint it, let it dry, but not overnight. Like let it dry for like 5 hours, 6 hours, you're fine. But if you let it dry for like an overnight thing, the color goes away. Apply your next layer, do the same thing. Apply your next layer, do the same thing. Then seal it with, I used olive oil because that's what I had. And I figured that's a period oil, I'll use that. You could probably use anything to seal it just so that it doesn't continue to lose its moisture. And instead of getting brown with like a hint of a touch of red, you get a nice brick red. And again, this is a sample from 7 years ago. So it has not faded. It has not, like it's a really nice, rich brick red. But the trick is not letting it dry fully. Now, because we have 10 minutes, and I know I'm kind of cruising through this, but a lot of the instructions are all in the handout, so I'm not going to spend too much time. In the handout, I've got a list of all of the supplies and where I can get them. I've got some online links. So my way in BC is great. Kremer Pigments in the US, in New York is great. They've got like that's where I get my dried buckthorn berries. I order them from there. There's a store in Montreal. I can't remember the name of it, but I've bought some supplies from them too. I've got your references with all of your sources. The one thing I will say that is not in here, but I've done some experimenting, and it's totally a period practice of overlaying two dyes on top of each other. So, as an example, I was asked to work on to dye a book cover for a friend of ours who is very Tudor, and her favorite color is orange. Like, I don't have an orange dye, but I have a red dye, and I have a yellow dye, and one of them contains alum, and the other one requires a base of alum. So if I do the yellow dye first and then put the red dye on top of the yellow dye, maybe I'll get orange. Guess what? I got a really nice Tudor orange. So if you know the chemistry and you can look at how the layers might interact together, you could actually make a period dye color that's not in the manuals, but is made up of two different period dyes laid over top of each other. Because unlike a modern dye, the period dyes they're somewhat translucent, I guess. So like a period dye, you can see the leather grain underneath it. You're not painting something on top and like putting a film over top of it. And so you can see the layer underneath. So if you do a nice yellow and then you do a thin layer of red on top, you get orange. So there may be options there for green too, right? Like and some of the recipes suggest that too. I did a purple book cover that turned out more brownish purple, or burgundy, but that's the same thing I did. Whereas like I'm experimenting. Okay, it says that if you change the acidic level of your liquid, that it'll give you a different color. So that's where I threw a Tums in to see what it did, and it turned more kind of brownish purple. Great. It's not quite the color I wanted, but it's not the red. And that was for my Laurel, and she said it looked like it came out of a bog. And like to me, that's a compliment, right? Because it's like it looks like it could have been made 500 years ago, and then we found it. So, I'll take it. So that's the class. I like to leave a little bit of time at the end if there's any questions, or comments, or thoughts, or ideas for what might work better. But yeah, so open the floor if anybody had any questions or comments.
What's your the one that like the Holy Grail one, the one you really want to do that you haven't had a chance to do yet?
My wife's heraldic color is purple, and there is one purple recipe in the manuals. So that one's on my list, but it contains like some of these recipes contain questionably safe ingredients. So it's one of those ones that I would have to do outside because I don't want to boil some of these chemicals in the house. So it's one of those ones that I have to do in the summer when I have time, and usually my summers get so full that I don't end up getting it done. But that would be the one that I really want to do, just because then I could make like something purple for her and she'd love it. My heraldic color's blue, so it would be nice, but that seems not likely to be terribly successful anytime soon. An atlas of medievally important plants. That would be cool. Yeah. Um, the, my my next step is, like I said, I've built a bit of a database, and I want to try to find a way to put it online so that people can kind of not have to go to each of the period resources, but just like look it up and search for it. So that's kind of my next project. Honestly, the thing that irritated me the most was when I was trying to do my research and nobody was publishing it. Nobody was sharing it. And so that was kind of the reason why I went to the publisher and asked them for permission to share the recipes, because I wanted to actually share it publicly so that like this myth that they didn't have colored leather would go away. There's more people doing it now than there was 5, 6 years ago. I think it's starting to be realized that it's a thing. But yeah, it's still not as common, I think, as some other areas of research. Yeah, it is 100% totally achievable. It is. And especially if you're using, the yellow one or something that's really like an easy one to do. I haven't with the coatings to use on top of the dyes to try to get it to not rub off. So that would be in other areas. What did they use to kind of fix their leather dyes and coat their leather? That would be, because then you don't have to worry quite as much about whether it's color fast because it'll be locked in. All right. Well, with that, if there's any other questions, I'll stick around, but I will let you free with 5 minutes to go before the next class. Thanks all for coming.
Much
Thanks so
appreciated.
much.